Hello, everybody. I'm Pastor Donovan Law, and it's week 11. And hopefully, you've been reading through your Bible each week. If not, no worries. Just pick right up here where we are with week 11. And I'm going to pick up with just a few verses from your readings this week in Proverbs chapter 11. Now, when we look at the Old Testament, one thing that you may notice and you may not have noticed is there's a lot of different types of writing in the Old Testament. And just to break that down for you, there's not just different types of literature, but they're represented by different personas, and you have to remember that when you look at the Old Testament. Like, for instance, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the Pentateuch, written by Moses, those represent the law of God, and the persona that's represented is the priest. And that's one of the first things that you see God establish under the rule of Moses. Also, as you read through the Old Testament, you'll notice prophetic literature. Sometimes that comes out in stories and history. That's obviously represented by the prophet, the persona of the prophet. But another type of literature that you may have also noticed are what we call wisdom literature, or represented by the Psalms, the Proverbs, Lamentation. And they are represented by a character that maybe we don't recognize as much, and that's the sage. And the most notable sage was obviously King Solomon. He was a guy who was filled with wisdom. And what's represented by that body of literature is this emotional, not only just an emotional state, but also this cause and effect and common sense. And we see that a lot in the Proverbs. You look in the Psalms, you see a lot of different emotional things, but in the Proverbs and in Lamentations, there's a lot of practical instruction. Let's look at Proverbs chapter 11, verses 12 through 17. Great example of what we're talking about and in our reading for this week. Proverbs 11, 12 through 17. Whoever belittles his neighbor lacks sense. So hopefully you haven't been belittling your neighbor. But a man of understanding remains silent. You know a lot of people. Some of them, you can probably think of different types of people who fit into one of these categories. And people gain credibility based on whether they fall into one or the other. If someone is someone who's a person of few words but have a lot of credible statements, they obviously had a lot of credibility. If someone comes to you and is gossiping about someone else, you probably don't trust them because you're probably going to be talked about next. Let's go on. Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered. Where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in abundance of counselors there is safety. All this is great wisdom. See how that's coming out in the wisdom literature and through the eyes of the sage, through the eyes of a person like Solomon. And we continue. Whoever puts up security for a stranger will surely suffer harm, but he who hates striking hands in pledge is secure. A gracious woman gets honor, and violent men get riches. A man who is kind benefits himself, but a cruel man hurts himself. Just great wisdom that you can find from the Proverbs, and I think it's a great thing that each and every week we have readings from the Proverbs, because there's stuff in here that is just common sense. And I think it shows the equity of God when we can see, yes, God is a God of laws, but God is a God of passion like the prophets. But God also has put in place common sense so that we don't have to go to God in prayer to ask God, should we stand out in the rain while it rains and it's cold? Because we know that we might get sick. And we know there are certain laws that are in place, like, the law of gravity. You never see it, but walk off the top of your roof and see if it still exists. It does. So God creates these things, and the Old Testament writers thousands of years ago wrote about them, and we get to read them today and apply them to our lives.